Hello, everyone. I'm going to welcome you to Chapter 11 Personality. Okay, let me move myself over. Okay, this chapter is all about personality, which essentially is a long, enduring, consistent way of how you see the world, how you participate in the world, how you move about in the world. So, your personality is a pattern, a distinct pattern about your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And it's your individual pattern. So it's a very individual aspect of who you are. And it helps you move about the world, your culture, your community. In psychology, we study personality through personality theory. And we describe, explain how people are similar, how they're more similar, and how they are different, and why we are uniquely who we are. The first person to really dig into personality was Sigmund Freud. He developed the psychoanalytic theory, which basically looked at unconscious processes, desires, urges, drives. He developed a whole psychotherapy called psychoanalysis out of his theory, which he looked into dream interpretation, free association, our early childhood experiences. Nowadays, we use psychodynamic theory, but he was really the first individual in modern psychology to talk about personality development. And he did so looking at the three divisions of the mind, or three structures of the mind: the id, the ego, and the superego. If you've ever watched any kind of cartoons, you've seen this play out. One of the very famous cartoons is Tom and Jerry, the cat and the mouse cartoon. And Tom Cat often is antagonistic person, or antagonistic character in the cartoon, who's trying to get Jerry the mouse. And sometimes he has his consciousness and unconsciousness helping him in that process. This is the exact thing of what the id, the ego, and the superego is. The ego is who you are. You're conscious. It develops early in infancy. It's around logic. It is part of the logic principle, reality principle. Then you have your id, which is your party animal of your personality. It's all about fantasy, fun. It is moved by the pleasure principle. And then we have the superego, which is basically your morality, your that makes you feel guilty, and also is based upon the morality principle. Often this is depicted by a iceberg. The id is all unconscious. It's all underneath the surface. And then you have the ego that is primarily in your consciousness. And then you have the superego that floats between your consciousness, subconscious, and unconscious processes. But the id is the one part of the structure of your personality that is all unconscious. It's all driven by drives and urges, as Freud would say. And your ego is the one that has to mitigate or balance between the id and the superego. And how it does that is through defense mechanisms. But before we get to our defense mechanisms, let's talk about one of Freud's most controversial aspects of his development of personality and his development of who we are as beings. And he talked about the psychosexual stages of development. You probably have heard of this kind of ad hocly or by the fly. If you ever heard someone say, "Oh, they're so anal." Well, if a person says, "Oh, they're so anal," or "that person's so anal," they're pulling from Freud's psychosexual stages of development. It We have the oral, the anal, the phallic, and the latency and the genital stage. Each one of these stages, Freud says, you go through it. It starts at birth, it ends at adolescence, and each of them has hallmarks of the stage. So if you are fixated in one of these stages, then that means that your development has been arrested or stopped at that point. Now, for this Freudian psychosexual stages of development theory has been debunked um, through kind of empirical basis. It was never really empirically supported. But you'll see it in every psychology textbook. Those who practice psychoanalysis will talk about it, kind of on the side, not really looking at it in terms of development and how people actually develop. They really focus more on the id, the ego, and the superego, and talk about ego development. This is why this whole psychosexual stages of development is no longer really used as a basis of looking at individuals, but it's a historical reference. Remember, I said the ego and the superego in the id are all kind of in a fight with one another. The ego's in a fight of pushing, unconsciously, not realizing why these drives and urges are happening. And the superego is giving the guilt and putting on the morality of the ego. And to ward off of that, the ego uses what we call defense mechanisms. And matter of fact, these defense mechanisms were highly developed out of Anna Freud, who is Freud's daughter, who was the only one of his children who really went into the field of psychiatry. So we have some of the main defense mechanisms are denial, displacement, projection, reaction, formation, and regression. And essentially, here, let me move myself over a little bit so you can see it a little bit more clearly down here. Here we have some definitions and some examples of each one of those. So make sure you take a look and take a peek at those as well. Okay. Um, I also have a second chart to give you some more examples of the defense mechanisms. uh, Freud was controversial in this whole psychosexual stages of development. And so there were individuals who were deemed as the dissenters or neo Freudians. And they are Karen Horney. It looks like horny, but it's Karen Horney or Horney. Uh, Carl Gustav Jung, Alfred Adler were all proteges, and especially Carl Gustav Jung, who worked under Freud, who trained under Freud, and they broke off with him because of the psychosexual stages of development and his focus on sexuality. And they all moved the sexuality piece out of psychoanalysis and formed psychodynamic theories and replaced it with social aspects. So both all three of these dissenters all focus on the social aspects of how your personality develops. So Karen Horney looks at anxiety related to security and social relationships. Carl Gustav Jung, this is what the introvert and extrovert and collective unconsciousness is all about. He believed that we all are connected as a human race, as human beings, through a collective unconsciousness that drives all of us to be connected to one another. And Alfred Adler talked about our feelings of wanting to be the best that we can be, and being superior, even though our angst and our feelings may push us to feel inferior. So all of these theorists still talk about early childhood experiences and how that develops in your later life as well. So when we move on into the aspects of personality and we look at the social cognitive perspective, we have to talk about Albert Bandura. Bandura is the one who kind of thoroughly developed the social cognitive theory. So here, keeping the social aspects and the thinking, cognition, understanding, thinking, and learning aspects. And he focused on observational learning. And observational learning basically is following a model. The model is rewarded, the model is paid attention to, the model is seen as someone important. So as a result of that, we will fashion our way after the model. If you are a sibling, if you had an older brother and sister that you admired, you may model your behavior after that older brother and sister. If you had an older brother and sister that you didn't admire that got in a lot of trouble, you may change your whole way of being because of that. That would be an example of observational learning. The other aspect of social cognitive is that there is interaction between our behaviors, our environment, and what we think about all those all together. This is what we call reciprocal determinism. And so reciprocal determinism is that secular circular and cyclical nature of how we connect ourselves. So our personality is developed out of the environment that we're in, what we think about the environment, that's the environment, our situational factors, and our thinking, how we see ourselves, and the behavior that we demonstrate. So personality is out of observational learning and the interaction of us in our environments and what we think about our environments. The third force of psychology is what we call humanism. And the key individual that is connected to this one is Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, but more so Carl Rogers, because Carl Rogers really took it to another level. He talked about self concept, and this is our thoughts and feelings about who we are. He says there's an ideal self and a real self, and these two kind of interplay with one another. And when they're even keeled in homeostasis, we are well adjusted. When there's some incongruency, when there's some imbalances, then this is where maladjustment comes into play. So he says that we must pay attention to what people are saying and what people are doing, and not put any kind of controls on individuals. And that's how individuals grow and develop. Now, the humanistic third force also looks at early childhood experiences, but not as extensively as psychoanalytic. And it looks at it in a more positive way. This is why it's called the third force, because it moved away from kind of the pragmatic approach of kind of the behavioral camp, behavioralism, and the negativity or the heavy emphasis of early childhood experiences. So this is one of the psychological personality theories that has been looked at and has been embraced by a lot of counseling services and counseling programs. It's also Carl Rogers is also the person who created client centered therapy as well. So if we look at ourselves and how we describe ourselves, what would you say about yourself? I would say I'm gregarious, I'm outgoing, I'm funny, I'm smart. Then I would be defining myself in terms of traits or dispositions that leads to how I respond in my environment. So the trait theories basically look at our way of being in terms of our typical behaviors. And sometimes traits are defined as kind of how people described us. So it's a lot of adjectives that we hear people saying about us. One of the biggest trait theories, as we see here, is McCrae and Costas. McCrae and Costas theory talks about the big five, which spells ocean: open to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So this is one of the highly empirically based personality theories. Your assignment is around kind of the big five factors that Neo personality theory is around the big five factors. And we talk about low scores and high scores. Many of the personality tests that are used for research are based upon using McCrae and Costa's five factor model. So, what about culture and who we are in terms of our personalities? And we can say that culture is not monolithic. It embraces where the language we speak, the identity that we identify with, where we live in the world. It encompasses a broad range of our experiences, as we know, as we talk about in us who study culture and psychology. Oftentimes we talk about individualistic cultures and collective cultures. And it's not one is superior to the other. It's just the approach of how the culture sees them individuals within the culture and how the culture defines itself in relationship to society. So when we're talking about culture and personality, we're going to be talking about where culture comes from, the indigenous nature of culture, okay, the original peoples of where the country we're talking about, and personality styles, and also kind of the comparative version of how we see cultures around the world and we compare the cultures. So these factors are very important when we talk about personality and culture. Now, what do psychologists do? Well, we test. This is the bread and butter of what psychologists do. This is what we train to do, and this is what we do exclusively. So, if you ever need to have a question answered about who you are as an individual, you may be tested by a psychologist. And the first thing that we may give you is a self report inventory. And this is a psychological test that is geared toward how you feel about your own feelings and behaviors, and they're usually very objective in the nature, because it is about how you're seeing yourself, and there's usually a right and wrong answer, yes or no, true or false, and we compare what you answer to a group of norms. If you remember from chapter 1, uh, well, really chapter 2, research design is a comparative of a sample of individuals and how they all are related in their answers. So most psychological tests are based upon norms. So they are given to a wide representative sample of individuals, and then when anyone else takes the test, we look at their individual score in relationship to this normative score, the wide sample of individuals. So personality tests come in objective formats and also what we call subjective formats, which trace back to psychoanalytic theory in the defense mechanism projection. Okay, so the idea with projection is that you project your feelings onto the test that you're taking, and that you when you project that those feelings, it's really giving us the true feelings of how you feel. So it's kind of an indirect way to get to your true feelings, versus objective tests are really going to ask you straight out what your feeling is, and you're going to report those. Okay, most of the times they've been standardized, they've been normed and validated to measure what they're supposed to measure. And one of those tests is the MMPI. Now, the MMPI stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is a clinical based personality test. And there's 567 items, true false items. And we use this within the state mental hospitals. We use this with the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations. Police departments use it. It's used in competency forensic evaluations because it's an objective, standardized, a validated, reliable test. And here are some examples of questions, simulated items, and questions on the MMPI. I'm often very tense on the job. True, false. I'm worried about sex. True, false. Sometimes I think so fast I can't keep up. True or false. So there are scales that have been embedded in this test to tease out whether or not you're trying to put yourself at a good light, whether you're lying, whether you're trying to hide anything. It's a very well validated test, and it's a test that can go stand up to a courtroom interrogation by lawyers. So it's used in to competency trials. So individuals, their question of their mental health is in question, we would give them an MMPI with a number of other tests. You just don't give one test, you give a battery of tests. And this would be one of the tests that we would give for those individuals. There are clinical scales 1 through 10. 0 is really 10, social introversion. And there are hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviant, masculinity, femininity, paranoia, psychoanesthesia, schizophrenia, hypomania, social introversion. These are all clinical based scales. This was normed on a clinical population, which means it was normed on people who had psychiatric or mental health diagnosis, in a non psychiatric population. So it has very good normative data. And the kind of the nitty gritty of this test is you take the test and then we scale you, we kind of plot your answers, and we look for trends. And the trends correspond to the numbers. So you'll get a number designation like 276 or 556 or 901. And each one of those codes corresponds to some behavioral, some personality, some mental health condition that you may be experiencing. Now, the other swinging of the pendulum of personality assessment are projective tests. These cannot be used in court because they're called very subjective. They are looking into variations of who you are, and they may have different themes. They're not singular in what you see. Now, what you see here are some of the actual pictures of the ink blot tests, Rorschach ink blot test that was developed by Herman Rorschach. What he did, he took black and white and color boards, painted them, and then folded them in half, and you have these mirror images. This is a test that we give to individuals. We give them each one of the cards, we hand it to the individual, and we ask them, tell us what you see. People see more than one thing. And we write down verbatim what the person sees. And then once we get through all the cards, we go back and ask details about the card and what the individual saw in the details. This is scored through a very extensive scoring um, methodology. It's not the easiest thing to learn. This is what psychologists learn how to do. If you're a psychometrician, if you are an assessment person, you would do these quite often, and you have a lot of clinical experience behind it, and you would see trends and identify trends. If you ask a clinical psychologist if they were only offered to give one test to an individual, usually we do not. We do a battery of tests. But if you only had one opportunity to give one test, most people would say the Rorschach ink blot test because it taps into a wide variety of experiences and mental health conditions, and it gives us a broad picture. After you give the Rorschach ink blot test, then you may do a cognitive test on a person's intelligence. You may do a behavioral assessment. You may do a self report inventory. You may give a behavioral intervention test like the Vineland. All of those kinds of tests may be given for an individual to give a clear picture. Now, we just don't test because we want to find out stuff because just for our general knowledge. Most of the times, if you're going to get a psychological assessment test done by a psychological professional, a master's level or clinical, doctoral level clinical psychologist, there has to be a reason for that. Do you suspect that a child has attention deficit disorder or autism? Does an adult suffer from anxiety or depression? And those is the reasons why you would get a psychological assessment test. So the Rorschach ink blot test is considered what we call a projective test. Another projective test we have is a thematic apperception test, the TEAMS, the multicultural thematic apperception test, and the contemporized themes concerning Black test. I have all these tests sitting on my shelf in my office. And essentially, these are projective tests that you would give to clients that, especially the latter two, to clients that who are non-white, and they have the norms, and they also are seem to in the research to give a more culturally appropriate um, culturally appropriate answers and scenarios for those individuals. You see, these are kind of examples of the tests. In the picture with the young man above is an example of the thematic apperception test. The difference between the teams and the thematic apperception tests and the CTCB is the pictures that are depicted. they are more culturally relevant for those particular non-white populations. And they're created to have more culturally fair assessment, because this has been one of the thorns in the side of assessment, is that the tests have not been culturally appropriate and culturally fair. Even though there's a lot of talk these days about not wanting to kind of embrace this idea of cultural appropriateness, or looking at what is culturally relevant for individuals. In the field of psychology, we have a lot of history, a lot of evidence, a lot of empirical evidence saying that this is important and relevant, especially when we're doing assessment. Okay? So, this is what we are talking about this semester. This chapter is all about personality. Okay, I've been talking about culture all semester because I'm teaching another class in cross cultural psychology. So this has been Dr. Lucas. I hope you've enjoyed this little quick overview. I didn't want to make it long for you because I know on average people watch this for about 3 minutes. So if you got to the end, thank you. Thumbs up, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you soon.